Hello, everybody. We're going to get started. And before we introduce our keynote, Vicki, Arroyo, we're going to do just a little bit of kind of recap of the weekend and, more importantly, thank everybody involved. So my name is Samantha Fotenhauer. I'm the 2L here at Tulane and the chair of the 21st Annual Environmental Law and Policy Summit. I had a lot of fun this weekend and a lot of fun putting this together. It was great to meet and chat with some of y'all and to see people engage and enjoy the panels and each other. One of my favorite parts of the summit are the unexpected conversations and dialogue about issues that I didn't know were going to come up. For example, in the rebuilding and redeveloping New Orleans panel, I'm sure some of you were in there. The panel concluded with a lively discussion about retreating from southern Louisiana and whether New Orleans was even worth investing in and rebuilding. And it was awesome. It was a lot of great thoughts and conversations, and maybe not necessarily surprising, but it wasn't a discussion I expected, and I really enjoyed it. And that's kind of the thing that happens with the summit. We spend all these months planning it, and we may know like what the brochure will look like and where the food's coming from, but we don't really know how the panels will turn out until they happen. And we don't really know how they'll take shape and come to life until it comes to this weekend. And that was really neat to see those things happen. But the real reason I'm up here is because I want to thank all the people that made this weekend possible. First, thank you to the attendees who showed up and being an enthusiastic audience. Thank you to the speakers and moderators who contributed their expertise and their knowledge and to the panels. And thank you to our many sponsors without whom we would not be able to have this event, and we certainly would not be able to keep it free to the public. Thank you to last year's summit team who gave us their time and showed us the ropes. To Professor Houck and Professor Davis, thank you for your guidance, your kindness, and your willingness to be available to us whenever we needed you. Without you, we'd be lost and much more overwhelmed. And more importantly, thank you to the students who volunteer monitoring the rooms, checking in attendees, and everything along the way. And thank you to the great summit board next to me for putting this together. Let's introduce them. Amanda Crawford, who our finance chair, who set the budget, kept us to it, sort of, fundraised to make it a reality, and managed all of our expenses and all of our reimbursements. To Guy Bogan and Jennifer Bergeron, our great speaker chairs, for imagining their panel topics, for making them realities by identifying speakers, contacting them, organizing it, bringing them here, and really giving this summit everything that makes it great, or a good weekend. For Andrew Howland, our logistics chair, for bringing 20 people to and from the airport, or I'm sorry, not travel chair, 20 people to and from the airport, getting to the hotels, booking the hotels, and making sure all the accommodations were ready and in place. Nicole Rodriguez-Fierro, who's our hospitality chair, she makes sure that everybody is fed, provided breakfast, lunch, reception for 150 people, and got a lot of donations, so that didn't come out of our budget. Amanda Callahan, who, as Houks says it, job is to get butts in seats and make sure that people know about this event happening, and coordinated all this, doing a lot of it, recovering from knee surgery. Chance Raymond for coordinating our CLE credits so attorneys can get credit for this great event. Allison Skopek, who designed our website, our brochure, and Brendan Hughes, president of the Energy and Environmental Law Society.
Sam, I want to thank you for keeping all of us in check.
Oh, and there's, of course, a reception following, so please stick around and enjoy that.
That's actually a harder act to follow than you'll ever know. And even though they thank the faculty advisors, which they are by their admission contract at Tulane required to do, the management of faculty is a substantial part of this job, because we all have ideas of how it should happen, but no real idea of how to do it. So, the fact that, not only this group, but 20 previous groups have done that is astounding, because in all fact, this is the 21st first annual summit, because every year it's invented new, with some help from the past, but the students, the issues, the opportunities, there's no copying. You have to reinvent it, and that's part of the excitement. So let's give them one more hand. And for Amanda Callahan on the butts and seats, I'm sorry we just couldn't get anyone to come. Well, we've arrived at the culmination of 2 days of peace, love, and law and the environment. So, and it's been a fascinating ride, and if you're like me, you didn't get to attend every session you wanted to, you didn't hear every speaker you wanted to, and you didn't get to meet everybody you wanted to meet. That's the way it's supposed to be. You're supposed to leave here with a sense of excitement and a little bit of a sense of you missed something. So come back next year and maybe you can fill that gap. But it's not over until we have our concluding keynote. And obviously, a theme that has been very prominent in this particular summit is climate change. Not entirely by accident, I rather suspect. But it's also been very prominent in the news with COP21, the clean energy plan. All these things happening involving the Supreme Court, the White House, Congress, all candidates running for governor, candidates running for president. But in fact, it's not just about them. It's about the rest of us who are in fact going to have to live in a world that's changing. And that even if politics gets in the way sometimes, people have to sometimes find ways to influence politics and, of course, to get along with their lives. That's why I was really so happy when Vicki Arroyo was selected to give the closing comments. Vicki is the executive director of the Georgetown Climate Center at Georgetown University, which when I went there, they didn't have anything like that. Who knows what my career would have looked like had it been there. And previously, she worked at the Pew Center on climate change. So she's been doing this for a long time. And it's not only intellectually stimulating, but Vicki is a New Orleanian. She grew up here. She has family here. She has family here at Tulane right now. So this is not a spectator sport for Vicki. And I think that's an important thing for us to all to understand, is that living with change and influencing positive aspects of it is not something we can entrust just to others to do for us. We're participants in this game, whether we wish to be or not. So I urge you to embrace it. And that's what Vicki has done, perhaps better than almost anybody I know. Because while there are folks who are out there working on the advocacy side from any number of points of view that view this as either a purely science issue, a purely political issue, or a purely legal issue, Vicki and her work at Georgetown have really been trying to pull those threads together to think in terms of not only how do you avoid climate change, but how do you adapt to it, because one way or the other, even if we stop climate change, at least the human-induced part tomorrow, enough change is coming at us that we are going to have to adapt. Here in New Orleans, we probably know that, or should know that, better than almost anybody on the face of the earth. And we shouldn't assume that plans, however bold they are going to implement themselves or even be the final version of those plans. That's what Vicki has an opportunity to do every day at Georgetown, and in many ways she does it on the behalf of all of us. So I'm pleased to introduce her as a colleague and a peer. But most important, I am just delighted to have Vicki Arroyo, my friend, back here in New Orleans. Thanks, Vicki, for joining us today.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Sam and Jennifer and Geyer and the two Amandas and Allison, and all the amazing students who put this together year after year. I mean, it's just such a delight to come here. And I was so honored when they called me and asked me to keynote, having come here over the years, off and on. And of course, I couldn't say no to Tulane, to Mark and to Ollie, who I respect so much. You're just so lucky, students, to have them as mentors and faculty. Two of my best friends graduated from Georgetown Law, including the late Sheila Langenhenisch. So I do this in her memory, and just thanks for the opportunity. So I want to take you back to 25 years ago, and I know that's before some of you were born, but I know some of you, Daryl, and some of you have known for longer than that. In 1990, the IPCC report came out for the first time, telling us that climate change was a problem. The world was coming to a scientific consensus on that issue. And you might not remember, but George H.W. Bush came into the White House running on a platform saying that he was going to counter the greenhouse effect with the White House effect. Remember that? Gro Harlan Brundtland, that's her next to him, and other world leaders, and Bush, negotiated the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change until the Paris Agreement. That was really the high watermark in having 196 countries taking part and agreeing to reduce dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. How many of you remember Buddy Roemer? Yeah. I worked for Buddy Roemer. So when I was not even 25 myself, I moved here from EPA in Washington. I moved back home to work for Buddy Roemer in his administration, led by Paul Tomplay, the DEQ. And I see Rob Morrow, who worked on our team. It's so awesome to be back. We worked largely on toxic pollution and on criteria, air pollutants, and conventional pollution, as it's called. But you can imagine my delight as a young person, not much older than you, maybe not older than you, when I was asked to represent the governor at meetings of the NGA, the National Governors Association Global Warming Task Force, 25 years ago in Washington, D.C. And you might be surprised, given the state of the politics now and how partisan it is, that there was a bipartisan global warming task force, not to mention that a young person was representing us, which was sort of amusing. Madeline Coonan of Vermont, that's her at the bottom, was the leader of that, and she was great. She was actually the head of NGA for a time. And those of us staffing it who had really been focused on conventional pollution were really surprised and disturbed to see the projections of what might happen with rising CO2 levels that might happen in our lifetime and certainly in our children's lifetime. I remember the Alaska representative, the person who was working with the governor of Alaska, pulling me aside and saying, "Do you see what they're saying about fossil fuels? I mean, we've got to stop this." And I said, "Do you see what it's going to do to your state and mine? I mean, we're like on the front lines. We have to stop that, you know?" And it was really this moment that I remember, because I remember for the first and really last time, the thought went through my head, even though I was unattached and young, that was this a world that I could even bring a child into if these projections were going to come true in my lifetime, in our lifetimes? Well, fortunately, I got through that. And I'm here not only as a proud child of New Orleans who went to school with the person who took this picture in high school, but as a proud mother of a Tulane student who's right here, Chance, who came back home to New Orleans despite what happened to our family and probably many of yours in Katrina, losing their homes, and my own fear that it could happen again. And so I start this way because I want you to know that our past and our present and our future is very bound to New Orleans. And so, as Bernie Sanders says, it gives me no pleasure. He likes to say that about the war. It gives me no pleasure to say what's right. It gives me no pleasure to speak about a place as unique and special as New Orleans is quite vulnerable. But we all know that to be true, right? I mean, you heard about it in some of the earlier sessions. So much of the city below sea level, subsidence, wetlands loss, stronger storms, and rising seas. And what we've seen in storms like Katrina, Rita, Gustav, and Isaac, and on, is just immense. The physical toll, the personal toll, the human toll in terms of the loss of life, obviously, in Katrina. And here's a picture with Katrina's 80% of the city submerged. Now, obviously, you all know as well as anybody that the causes of Katrina were multifaceted, and it was largely the very deficient levees. But the very warm waters in the Gulf certainly contributed to its intensity. That hurricane season, as you'll remember, we had so many storms, many Category 4 and 5, that we actually ran out of letters of the regular alphabet and had to go into the Greek alphabet to the letter zeta, and Rita hit within weeks while people were still evacuating and moving on to where they were going to move on. And in my family's case, my house and our house. So the top house here is my mother's. She lived in Gentilly. That's not her car. It was actually carried there by the floodwaters that were up to her roof. And that's my sister Beth Utterback, who you might know from WYS-TV, and her husband Terry's house on Bel Air Drive, right by the 17th Street Canal Breach. And as you can see, they lost their homes and just about everything in them. They came up and lived with us for a time, and I saw firsthand, watching them go through this, how heartbreaking it was and how they were really struggling with whether or not to move back after the storm, whether or not the community would be back, whether or not their friends would come back. My sister, after staying with us for a while, said she felt like she was in the witness protection program. She was plucked out of her life and thrown into ours. And that's what I love about New Orleanians, is that they can always try to find humor in a really crap situation. Oops, did I say that? But because New Orleans is so unique and irreplaceable, she just had the sentiment, like, well, maybe they can find a place that we can all go together, with our food and our music and our culture that's just safer, and I could just see her like thinking through that over time. And I have to tell the story about my son Chance, because he actually, I think, got to their house maybe before them, because his dad, against my wishes, actually took him right through the front windows, which were broken in. And they salvaged some things, which was very nice of them. And he's 9 years old at the time and remembers that he was forbidden from eating, Cheetos and drinking Coke and stuff on that white carpet. And he came back to her and said, "If I knew your house was going to look like that, I could have drank Coke in your living room." We were laughing about that this morning at breakfast, my sister and I. So I love coming home. When I come home, though, to speak on these issues, my sister and her friends, these are sophisticated TV people, but they say, "What do you want us to worry about now?" And I like this slide because, we've all seen Inconvenient Truth, and some of us were in the cultural cognition panel and heard about showing people all the slides of facts, and I'll do some of that, I confess. But I do think that we need to face the facts and see some of those slides, because we really do have to prepare for a new normal that's not stable but dynamic. It's really more like preparing for the next normal and the next. And that's because we're well outside of the natural cycle of CO2 that we've seen for hundreds of thousands of years historically, as we've cycled in and out of ice ages that had historically been catalyzed by relatively small changes in the Earth's orbit, but then made worse by associated feedbacks, which is a fairly standard pattern over, at least 600,000 years or more. And the difference between the pollutants that are behind these changes that we're seeing now and the ones that I regulated as a young person in Louisiana by helping people like Kip Holden and Mike McDaniel draft an air toxics bill to reduce air toxics here, or my work at EPA in the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments, is that with those regulations, you could actually put a scrubber or something, some kind of device that would reduce the emissions literally overnight, 99% or more efficiency. Whereas these, as you can see from the lifespan in the air, once they're emitted, they continue to warm the atmosphere for hundreds or thousands of years. And we all contribute to this problem, so it's literally a super wicked problem in that regard, not in a good way wicked. We are already seeing the projections that I studied when I was your age becoming a reality, just since I've been working on this issue. Look at this chart. 10 of the hottest years on record have been since 1998. 2015 was the hottest year on record by quite a lot. And my husband, John Kerry, a science writer, told me today that January broke all kinds of records as well. So we're fixing to maybe break the record again in 2016. If we keep going at this pace, if the Paris Agreement doesn't hold, and I hope it will, and I think it will for reasons we could talk about later, by the end of the century, the U.S. could see an average temperature change of 11 degrees Fahrenheit under the high emission scenario. Now this, I think and hope, will be averted by global action, but we just have to face up to that. Already we're seeing the damage of climate change in terms of disasters that are on the rise, and the weather-related events, the meteorological events and the hydrological events, the storm events, floods, are on the increase, even where the geophysical events like tsunamis and earthquakes stay relatively constant, as you'd expect, because they're not climate-related. And of course, it's not just a Louisiana, Gulf Coast phenomenon. We've seen in the last decade a glimpse of what the future has in store in terms of a world with extreme weather and rising seas. The total of billion-dollar-plus events, we're just looking at the events that themselves cost $1 billion each, between 2005 and 2010 has been over $550 billion. The Government Accounting Office in 2013, for the first time, listed climate change as one of our major financial threats to the U.S. So this is along with entitlement spending programs and terrorism and things like that. And this is because, for one thing, as you heard from your other keynote speaker from the Department of Interior, the U.S. is a huge landholder, so some of that land is very vulnerable, and that's worth something. The federal government provides crop insurance and flood insurance, as you all well know here. And it, of course, bails us all out in the times of disaster. It provides disaster relief money. But, of course, this is an international problem as well. We've seen the impacts from sea level rise and extreme weather crippling the Philippines. The picture on the upper left-hand side is Typhoon Haiyan in 2013, which is the strongest typhoon or cyclone ever recorded until Hurricane Patricia surpassed it in 2015. Flooding is already increasing. You're seeing the people in Chennai, India. So this section of Southeast India, while we were at the climate talks in Paris, was having these crazy rains that killed 400 people and displaced 1.8 million people, even while we were there at the talks in November and December. The picture on the top right is a water-scarce region of Kenya. This part of Eastern Africa has seen persistent heat and drought threatening the food security of an estimated 18 million people. Think about what that means to migration. Think about what that means to the migration from rural areas to cities, and as we've seen in Syria, sparking conflicts, often ethnic conflicts or economic conflicts, and migration pressures as people are displaced. And even in relatively rich countries, or rich countries like ours, as we saw in Katrina, as we saw in the Chicago heat wave of 1995, where that body bag is being carried out, we actually are vulnerable here. We have people, especially the lower income people, racial minorities, older people are the most vulnerable. And these impacts of climate change are often compounded in poorer communities and countries that don't have the adaptive capacity that the rest of us have, that don't have the family living in the Washington, D.C. area who can take them in and provide for them when they've lost their jobs and their homes. And that's something that we all have to be better about. As you heard from the solicitor, wildlife is affected as the oceans and climate warms. Ocean acidification results from the CO2 mixing with the water to form carbonic acid, eating away shells of oysters. I mean, come on, oysters. Like, if you're not really worried about that in Louisiana, I don't know what to worry about. I think I've eaten my weight in oysters in the last 2 days. Pest overwintering and migrating north. And we've seen that with Lyme disease. And of course, there's a huge concern right now with the Zika virus in Brazil, but moving along up. But what really keeps me up at night, in addition to when my son comes home for spring break and doesn't tell me when he's going to come home, is what's happening at the poles. And you saw the Arctic yesterday, and we talked about this. I'm taking you to the very ends of the earth now from something closer to home. Obviously, the ice loss means more sea level rise, but it also means that because where we used to have ice cover and white reflective snow, you have a dark ocean that's absorbing the heat. That further leads to feedbacks. We're also worried about feedbacks from, of course, methane releases in the Arctic. I had the opportunity last month to go to Patagonia and to Antarctica, and I saw changes at the other end of the earth and had the opportunity to be photobombed by this penguin. And it's important when you do climate change shocks that are really pretty depressing to have light moments. And I was going to show you the video, but I thought that might be too complicated for me. But he was just so darn cute, and he just walked right up there. We were at this Chilean research station. We went out on the Chilean Navy's boats that often cooperate in rescue efforts and other things, and we saw these giant icebergs. You really can't sense the scale, but this one here that looks like this massive castle is just bigger than any building I've ever seen. And while they're quite beautiful and stunning, what's really disturbing is that these are calving off of Antarctica, right? And so as that happens, then more of the ice can sort of like slide off the ice shelves, the ice sheets. And you can see this in terms of the satellite measurements, what's happening. The actual projections don't really nail what's happening because we're seeing the ice loss faster than what any models have predicted, in part because they really haven't accounted for the warming of the ocean water underneath the ice shelves. And the fact that when the ice melts on the surface, it sort of cuts through like a knife and then just sort of like pushes it off, right off the land. And that's, of course, what helps to raise the sea levels. And we're seeing sea level rising at an accelerated rate. So the current IPCC has said that we might face something like, a few feet up to 6.5 feet in this century. More recently than the IPCC report, the 5th IPCC report, Jim Hansen and a bunch of other noted scholars have said that it might be 10 feet in the next 50 years. And what folks have done with the projections, if we just sort of stay on a business as usual course, is doing some art, if you will, some pictures of what 9 meters might look like, because some people say that we're on track for that if we continue at the current rate of warming and don't avert the 4 degrees warming that we might have in the absence of some agreement like the Paris Agreement really taking effect. You can picture in your own mind, if this does this to the bull on Wall Street, what this would do to some of the monuments in New Orleans. And I know there's a lot of controversy right now about monuments in New Orleans, and I'm not going to wade into that. Except to say, I know, it's really bad. I live with the punter. It's really bad. But I just hope that people here are thinking about the future as much as they're having these active debates about the past and the present, because the times are changing. And this is our cue for some audience participation. Mark Davis is going to come help me here. Okay, so I think all of you, like the people who are as old as Bernie Sanders and the people who are going to vote for Bernie Sanders in this room, probably know who this is, and you know the lyrics and the song. And I actually abbreviated the lyrics because there's only so much I want to embarrass my son.
It works for
So,
IBM, I think.
okay, so ready? So Mark's going to actually do an impersonation of it. Ready? But you're all going to sing.
That's right.
And I know some of you. Okay, ready?
Gather round people wherever you roam. Admit that the waters around you have grown. And you better stop swimming. Sink like a stone. 'Cause the times, they are changing.
Thank you so much. So that's my cue to sort of shift from the changing times that we are physically observing to some changes that hopefully will give you a sense of hope. That gives me a sense of hope and optimism, and I work in Washington, D.C., so if I can have that, I think you can too. Our policy landscape is really changing since I worked on these issues 25 years ago and 15 years ago when the other George Bush was in the White House. We've seen fuel economy standards passed by this administration. We've seen a lot of state action, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the East Coast area, the cap-and-trade program in California, the Fran-Pavley standards that have become the law of the land with the fuel economy standards, state renewable energy standards in the majority of states, most of the states having demand-side management or efficiency programs, local action in the form of cities, including New Orleans. 1,000 mayors joined in the Mayor's Climate Protection Agreement. I did that yesterday. I don't feel so bad now. It's that one on the left. And enhancing preparedness and resilience. So we, of course, are just coming out of the climate negotiations. It was the largest gathering of the heads of state for any reason in history, which was quite amazing. Nearly 200 countries making commitments. Major emitters like US and China finally stepping up, developing as well as developed countries, with a mitigation target of staying below 2 degrees Celsius and ideally going to 1.5 degrees Celsius and decarbonizing by the end of the century. Some of us discussed this in a panel yesterday on Paris, and it was really an important turning point and signal to markets, investors, businesses, and the public. Our center's role was to highlight the work of the states, and we brought governors like Governor Jerry Brown of California, who came in spite of not only the Paris attacks, but actually the attacks in San Bernardino, which is really pretty remarkable after, of course, going and paying his respects and dealing with that. He did come to Paris. Jay Inslee from Washington State, Peter Shumlin from Vermont, and other state leaders, including Fran-Pavley, who's sitting there with me. She was on a panel with me with legislators around the world who gathered. She's one of my personal heroes, and she sent me a note today generously offering to come talk to our students at Georgetown. And I said, I have to tell you, I'm at Tulane to talk to their students, and I am going to tell them, you're my hero. Because she wrote a 10-page bill. She became an assemblywoman after being a school teacher for many years and a mayor for a short time, and she became an assemblywoman. And when George Bush and his administration walked away from the climate pledge that he made in the campaign, George W. Bush, to regulate CO2 emissions from power plants, which we're still litigating all these years later, and from the table at the Kyoto Protocol, She stepped up. So it just shows, I love to use this example with my students. It shows how one person can make a difference. She wrote this bill. It's 10 pages. I held it up in my class last week. It's like, look, it's 10 pages. And then it became the law of the land, of course. She had to defend it. California had to defend it. Schwarzenegger had to fight for the waiver, even against his own party's administration. People like Mary Nichols came with us to Paris. That's her sitting by me on the U.S. Center stage. Richard Kaufman from New York, who's the governor's energy czar there. Bill Ritter, former governor of Colorado, people from Quebec and British Columbia, including the premiers. The role of subnationals, or as Jay Inslee calls them, supranationals, is really important at these events to really show that the world is watching and that the local communities that are on the front lines really want to see movement. We also took some students, so I had to show you the pictures of students, and my colleague, Professor with the Robot. I'm not sure what that's about, but it's cute. The current pledges and the policies will, according to this climate tracker, bend down the curve, as you see here. The current policies don't get us to the below 2 degrees Celsius that we want. The pledges and the INDCs are now nationally determined contributions because they're not intended post-Paris, do at least get us below 3 degrees Celsius if they're done. Now, they're ambitious. It's not easy. We have a lot more work to do. And of course, as many of you know, we really had a setback last week. On Tuesday of last week, a key pillar in the U.S. climate agreement, the Clean Power Plan, which our center worked on very hard with many states. EPA worked on very hard. Many of you worked on very hard. The Supreme Court issued a stay that held up further work on that, at least at EPA's level, and denied hearing the case, or said that it won't take up the case again until they deny cert or take up the case and actually make a decision. So they're not even waiting just till the D.C. Circuit decides on the merits, which have not been heard yet. They're just waiting until it comes back to them. Very unprecedented. One paragraph, no real explanation. Very unusual. And of course, the concern, especially, not just that we're losing time and there's the Paris Agreement, we had all this great momentum, the world came together, is that gets us, that timeline gets us into a new presidency and the possibility of rolling back the regulation or not defending it before this litigation is completed. And in another development that made us feel like we were living in a Grisham novel, like Pelican Brief 2, you know, Justice Scalia died, right? And so everybody's wondering, like, what does that mean? Because the 5 people who blocked it are now 4. So it is true that half the states sued, and that might have been what got the Supreme Court's attention, among other things. But it's also true that we're working with about the other half of the states that haven't sued and who are really supporting it. And they got statements out really quick. We made sure that happened. And we have the positive statements, including attorneys general from a number of them, as well as governors and others on our website if you want to check it out. Here's one from Colorado. Here's one from Minnesota, here's one from Virginia, here's one from Pennsylvania. So it's not just the coastal states, it's not just the clean energy states, it's the states that actually have coal and other resources saying, you know, the rule is not going to go away. We're going to submit a plan, says John Quigley, the head of the DEQ in Pennsylvania. So that's really pretty cool. So that really gives me hope. This map is something that my staff threw together that shows that the public statements of the states, just since the stay, shows that a number of them are in the green category, either that they're going to say, yes, we're moving forward, or even though we're suing, we're moving forward with the planning anyway, we're still having our consultants work, like Louisiana has said, or we're considering our options, or we're going to press ahead doing work on clean energy. That third block in the key should be purple, by the way. But the good news is that you can see sort of the hell no red states are not very many. And I can tell you what, even though this is just the public states on the record, privately, a lot of these states are working. I think you heard a little bit of this yesterday in the Clean Power Plan discussion, and I'll tell you that some of these states are working because there's an NGA work group that's working, and some of these states like Alabama and Michigan are still attending those meetings. So at the staff level, the work has gone forward, the deadlines haven't been kicked out, and a lot of the utilities are telling them that they would really rather have the regulatory certainty to move forward, so I'm really heartened by that. But as you heard from Mark, Clean Power Plan or not, Paris Agreement or not, we're still committed to some degree of warming. And so we have to prepare for the changes. And we have an adaptation clearinghouse that really helps people. In the public, it's free. You can check it out. Look at what the changes are. We have toolkits for communities that are facing sea level rise and can use cool land use tools that have been around for a while, like easements and setbacks and things. They look at the options of either accommodating the water by building differently, protecting by having some kind of armoring, either hard armoring or soft armoring, or retreating. which is a real discussion, as you heard in an earlier session. We also track what states are doing on adaptation planning around the country. And the good news is that there are a lot of states, often coastal states, that have adaptation plans on the books that are pretty comprehensive across different sectors. The dark blue ones have them on the books. The light blue ones are working on them. The gray ones might have sectoral plans of some sort that are relevant, and the little black dots are cities that are doing work. And you can zoom in on any of them if you're students from someplace else and you want to see what's going on at home. And they can learn from each other. Part of what we're trying to do is to facilitate best practices because we're all learning by doing. And so this shows you that the states are very different in terms of how many goals they've had and how much their progress has been. But since we're at law school, I think it's also important to see what drives those plans. Sometimes it's legislation, and sometimes it's launched by an executive order. We've worked with Governor O'Malley when he was in Maryland on 2 executive orders that became legislation. So that obviously has more staying power, as the law students should know. That helps when you have changes in the governor's office. We have seen some rollback in Virginia and in Florida when Tim Kaine left office and when Charlie Crist left office, so it is really important. But there are some state employees plugging along in these states. California is a leader on adaptation as they are on mitigation, and you can go on our website and see the progress they're making to their goals. Many of these are legal and policy changes, like changing their NEPAs, their mini NEPAs, with climate change in mind. And it's not just planning, because the planning informs laws. And that changes regulation, it changes how we invest, it changes in terms of capacity building. So just a few quick examples. California has a CalAdapt tool, which gives local communities some tools to consider in making changes with climate change in mind so that everybody doesn't have to have experts on their staff. Most local communities can't do that. Washington State's 2012 plan recommended requiring consideration of climate change in the siting and the zoning and the construction of state-funded infrastructure projects. So the DOT, under their mini NEPA, built this ferry terminal differently. They built it higher. They built some of the structures that supported inland as a result of that. In Hawaii, they're generating resources because, of course, funding of adaptation is always a challenge, right? So this is Oahu's North Shore and the erosion that will be exacerbated by sea level rise. House Bill 444 authorized a hotel tax for funding beach restoration and conservation projects. In Boston, they've already done some cool things in buildings like the Spaulding Rehabilitation Hospital, which took in a lot of the victims of the marathon bombing. They had elevated that structure when they designed it with sea level rise in mind. They have operable windows so that if the power goes out, people still have some circulation. They built it as a green building. They lifted the electrical and mechanical systems in case there was a flood. And now Boston has a checklist for developers, so they actually have to try to build with climate change in mind. Okay, so we're back home to Louisiana. And it wasn't blue on the map, right? So there is no statewide adaptation plan, but obviously, you know, there's a lot going on. There's a lot around the Katrina anniversary with some city planning, and there's a lot of work on restoring the coast. The Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority has adopted the Comprehensive Master Plan. The implementation of that plan will cost a lot, and some of the money from the BP spill obviously will go to that, and the estimates are more than $50 billion over the next 50 years, according to Mark Davis. It includes a variety of strategies, trying to restore buffers, rebuilding islands, buying out communities. We worked at the Climate Center with some of our students on some projects related to this for the state in previous years. Of course, New Orleans benefited. We all benefited from the federal funding of holding back the water through various sort of gray infrastructure projects, if you will. And one of the things that I thought was interesting about this is that even though the Corps took into account sea level rise in this new investment to some extent, and it's hopefully, let's all hope, more protective than what happened with Katrina. Prior to Hurricane Katrina, the system of levees around New Orleans was referred to as the Hurricane Protection System, whereas now the Corps refers to it as the Greater New Orleans Hurricane and Storm Damage Risk Reduction System. So I think that shows a little bit more humility about what really we can expect. Of course, in the wake of the storm, some infrastructure changes are being made, including elevating the I-10 twin spans with sections knocked out in Katrina to 20 feet high. But again, because of federal policies, these tend to be backward-looking, like what happened in the last storm, as opposed to forward-looking. And as law students, I hope that some of you will consider careers in this area, because there'll be a lot of work in this area to help people adapt. And you have to not just look at the last storm, but obviously what might happen in the future. Brad Pitt's house and some of Brad Pitt's house, this is where he lives. The houses that he helped to contribute to elevating in the Make It Right buildings in the 9th Ward, of course, show some models of what can be done, although the changes I know from my mom's neighborhood in Gentilly are not uniform. And I see Jeff here, who worked with us on a report about collecting some of the water from heavy rain events in some of the vacant lots in neighborhoods like Pontchartrain Park and Gentilly. That's helping to recharge the water table and to hold water, not from a Katrina-like event, but from a more routine kind of heavy precipitation event. Here's my friend Gina McCarthy with your wonderful mayor, Mitch, celebrating the opening of one of those rain gardens down Wild Air Drive from where my mom lived. And I was really, really delighted to see New Orleans and Louisiana win something for change. Really win big, I thought, in the National Disaster Resilience Competition. My team at Georgetown worked as technical advisors, but we just advised anybody who asked. So I didn't have a role, but I was so delighted that the Gentilly projects in my mom's old area, the Mirabue Water Gardens and all that will get funded to help reshape the urban delta, trying to replenish the groundwater, as well as hold back the lake. We see from roads that we drive by all the time the importance in our medians or neutral grounds, as we're called, having places to store water. And we can learn from other cities like Philadelphia that have done a remarkable job of greening the city and providing for local jobs, for underemployed people, for new skill sets, and take advantage of the multiple opportunities and benefits of green space for recreation, for health, both physical and mental, for reducing the urban heat island effect, for absorbing and holding the water, for habitat, for wildlife, and so much more. This is a vacant lot in Detroit, and I looked out on this vacant lot, but this is not the picture I took because it was in the winter from a hotel that I stayed at. My husband grew up in Detroit, so we'd often trade stories about Detroit and New Orleans and which was sort of worse off post-Katrina. And of course, their problem is that so much of the land is underutilized, so many people have left. But here they're using a vacant lot to turn it into an urban garden that's used to supply food to a homeless shelter. So another example of win-win-wins. And when I go to Detroit, I always think, gosh, you know, you're on this freshwater body, you're inland, your climate's getting milder by the day in terms of the winter. Maybe some of us can think about moving back into Detroit. And that does bring up, you know, the conversation, that's such a difficult conversation about our boot of Louisiana losing land. And as many of you might know, the Louisiana NDRC application would fund, at least partially fund, resettling the Ile-de-Jean community. These are difficult conversations, both for those who are leaving their home, but also, I can say, from taking my own family in, you know, it's stressful for communities that are recipients of new folks too. And I don't think we really spent enough time thinking about these issues, so I was really delighted to see the federal government investing in Louisiana and Louisiana applying for and getting this. We're seeing more and more pressures both domestically and internationally from migration. And there have been some precedents where communities have chosen to move after repeated floods, and they've used their federal disaster money to move onto bluffs, for example, in Valmeyer, Illinois, which was flooded in 1993 and relocated to a site 400 feet higher. In Rhineland, Missouri, one of the 42 communities relocated at a cost of $60 million, but that investment is projected to save $200 million. So, you know, again, there's a personal toll to these moves, but when communities agree to go along with it, there is some precedent for that. I want to give you some examples from our center's work on preparing communities for climate impacts and recommendations that we made to President Obama's Climate Task Force of state, local, and tribal leaders, because especially for you law students, I think you might be interested in knowing that even though the administration has been very positive about dealing with climate change and preparing, they didn't necessarily support some of the state and local efforts to do so. So working with Vermont after Tropical Storm Irene, which had 300 bridges destroyed and 1,000 culverts, like you see there, blown out, they replaced those with these open bottom coverts that allow for greater fish passage and are obviously more resilient in an era of more precipitation, which we expect from climate change, which is happening. And yet they were denied from FEMA reimbursement because they built it differently, even though their state codes had this new structure on the books, because it also allowed them some discretion for their hydrologists to consider. So, that just shows that, we really have to look at our laws and figure out how we can make them more flexible for the communities that are trying to rebuild, so they're not just throwing good money after bad. Eventually, the feds got the message and are re-examining that denial. The Army Corps often incentivizes building hard armoring solutions like the seawall on the left. But obviously, for those of us who care about coast and habitat for fisheries and quality of life, we would like to see more of these living shorelines like the one on the right. Maryland has flipped the model of the Corps on its head, because generally the Corps will allow a general permit to do something like the seawall in just a matter of weeks, where it could take up to 3 years to do a living shoreline because it's sort of individualized. So some states like Maryland, and we're working with these, are really trying to flip that, to say, you have to explain to us why you're not allowing a living shoreline. I think the policy discussion really started to get elevated after Superstorm Sandy. It was obviously a huge storm causing a much broader impact, states all the way from Florida to Maine, and it really brought climate change into the public discourse. I'm not sure if that's the unusual path or the size of it or the fact that they're the biggest media center and it finally came to New York and it wasn't just those people in New Orleans. But we started to see some real innovation, including another partnership, an earlier partnership between the Rockefeller Foundation and HUD called Rebuild by Design, and we're doing an evaluation of some lessons from these early Rebuild by Design projects. In our most developed and valuable and productive and expensive landscapes like New York City, relocation is generally not an option, and they don't want to just put up a seawall that is barren and doesn't allow people to enjoy the space when there's not a storm. And so they're experimenting with this Big U project, envisioning 10 miles of protective features, including parks that can be used year-round, ringing the city. And New York has changed their building codes to elevate the equipment, like I said, in Boston with the checklist, to allow for operable windows, because as we know, after a storm, what often kills people, including here, is the heat that comes in, the fact that, or the cold in some cases, the fact that you don't have power for a long time. And then also changes to the landscape, like sloped sidewalks and tree pits to capture water. And it's not just happening in the coast, and it's not just happening in sort of the progressive states. Dallas and Houston have building codes now that are trying to reduce the heat island effect by having LEED standards and other requirements for water efficiency, for permeability of pavements, for Energy Star, and all that good stuff. So we've done work on the Washington, D.C. Sustainability Plan to incorporate consideration of climate change, and our colleagues at University of Michigan School of Public Health are creating a heat vulnerability map that incorporates both physical factors like the impervious surfaces, but also socioeconomic factors like chronic disease, income level, and social isolation that contribute to more risk when there is a heat wave. And so this will allow D.C. to target both green infrastructure investment, but also getting people out in time when there's a heat wave, getting them out to cooling centers. One thing that was interesting is Eric Kleinenberg's work looking at neighborhoods that were similar in the Chicago heat wave that I showed you earlier. So some similarly situated neighborhoods in terms of the age and the poverty and the race fared very differently. And what they found was that those neighborhoods with more sidewalks, grocery stores, like neighborhood stores, street life, and parks where people really knew each other were much better about taking care of each other than those that were separated, that were crime-ridden, that people were hunkered down. So I'm heading into the end here, and I want to finally just shift from, on that note about the human part of it, shifting from design and infrastructure changes to the human element. It's really important to have plans in place that consider what people look to when they make a decision to evacuate. When they see a sign like this, which looks a little humorous to us, please leave town, whether it's a fire or a flood or a storm. So this is one of our family photos that survived Hurricane Katrina. It's a photo of my dad. Some of you knew my dad, Sidney Oscar Arroyo. The year before Katrina in 2004, some of you will remember it well, Hurricane Ivan was bearing down on the coast, and we thought that that was going to be the big one. There was not a mandatory evacuation, but a lot of people evacuated, and the contraflow was sort of a disaster, and a lot of people were stuck. It was very, very stressful. My dad had been turned away from a hospital checkup for his heart because the hospitals were sort of going into lockdown mode. And he and my mom and my sister and others evacuated to a hotel. And when my sister went to pick him up from the hotel, she saw how white and flushed he looked, and she removed him from the hotel back to that hospital where he died that evening. And the lesson that some people took from what happened to my dad and other people that they knew in that really stressful, horrible evacuation just a year before Katrina is that it might just be safer to stay home. And of course, other people, it was the end of the month in Katrina, they couldn't leave because their paycheck hadn't arrived. There were single moms who were juggling both children and older people with medical needs. Others didn't leave because publicly available transportation and shelter would not allow them to leave their pets, often their only companions. And that was even the case in the rescues, which were rather heartbreaking. For those who stayed behind, 42% cited an unwillingness to leave their pets as a reason for not leaving. But fortunately, Congress, for once, was functional, and they passed the Pet Evacuation and Transportation Standards Act, which has required planning and accommodation for pets as well as for people. And so I just want to pause for a moment for the law students here and just note that, in this conversation, just in this one anecdote, there's the DOT people. I see my friend Bill, who works, on these issues, and who worked in the AG's office when I was at DEQ. There are people in state government who are really well-meaning people, but something obviously went wrong with that evacuation in 2004 that affected people's choices in 2005. Whether or not, you're the FEMA people who decide, what to do about the Superdome, whether or not you are the people who decide at the federal level what the cost-benefit formulas should be for your levies. There are so many opportunities for lawyers to really play a constructive role and to raise the climate question when we're making investments, when we're trying to advise people about what to do, about whether to stay or to leave. How do we prepare for disasters? How do we spend our flood insurance? So many wonderful opportunities to engage. Also, as not just a professional, but as a volunteer. I'm not really familiar personally with this group, but I've really been impressed from a distance to see how New Orleans has this evacueer sculpture now available in many parts of the city to identify places where people and their pets can go to get rides out of town before the next storm. And I think it shows the role of the leaders with initiative can make a difference, whether you're Fran Pavley writing a bill in California that becomes the law of the land, or people who just try to save their neighbors in the event of a future Katrina. And so the point that I want to leave you with is this. It's really up to all of us to look at our homes and our vulnerabilities and our exposures and to find ways to not just survive, but to thrive in a world that is going to look very different. Thank you.
To entertain Q&A. I can't believe we don't have Q&A.
Thank you. Yes, in the back. Yes.
Vicki, a couple thoughts for part of the challenge. It's common to, a lot of folks don't want to hear something negative said, but sometimes we have to face negative things. So I think it's important that if a negative thing's said, it can have constructive purpose. For instance, Louisiana is its own biggest problem on this issue, and it's a big problem for the country, and it's cost of support at the national level for the coast. Those are all facts, so something we have a chance to do something about now. Often people say positive things as they need encouragement. I hear folks say we need to move to a carbon-free economy in 50 years. You look at the numbers, is that really possible? Looks dubious, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't expand renewable energy, reduce emissions, do all the things we need to do. Right. Folks feel they need to hand a ready-made positive solution to people to make them feel like it's worth doing. I think it's a particular problem in America that we have now. People don't want to hear what they don't want to hear, and they want to hear, Anyway, where I'm going with this, I guess, is that...
Doug, do we have a question here?
Yes. Best to, especially in a cultural situation with so much dishonesty, just be honest with folks. And this is what we need to do. We have a lot of precedent for getting things done. But I sometimes worry about that, people unwilling to say something negative and then they feel like they have to say something positive, even if it really is not.
Yeah.
I think, Vicki, your answer is yes.
Yeah, well, yeah, my answer is yes, and I'll give you just one example of what I think is effective when I see some of the governors, like Jay Inslee coined the phrase that we're the first generation to see the impacts of climate change and the last generation to do something about it, and you've seen that in my own life and examples from 25 years ago to now. And what I've seen these governors, who of course are brilliant politicians or else they wouldn't be elected, right, do is they often use some anecdotes from their homes of the disasters that they're having to declare, 500-year disasters every 2 years in office, the wildfire seasons in Washington State, the ocean acidification that's affecting their oysters, Governor Brown declaring a state of emergency, 25% mandatory reductions of water use in California. And then they pivot from that to a message of, we are already building the clean energy economy. New York has just revisited its renewable standards and is pushing for 50% before 50 years. So is California. Vermont, 75%. Hawaii, 100%, in more than 50, well, 2045, I think. So, I mean, they're saying our experience with the RGGI states, with California, is that it really is possible. And when you start sending the signals in that direction, then you really start to have more of an even balance between the clean energy companies that have something at stake and show up to Paris and push the Clean Power Plan, than just the old dirties out there filing these lawsuits. And I really have seen that balance shift, and that's what really gives me hope.
Could I put a New Orleans perspective on this? Jim Hansen, that you cited earlier, has been the lead scientist on this, and sort of the Rachel Carson sounding the warning for decades. And he's never been wrong. And he's been projecting ascending lines when everybody else was projecting flat or even worse. So Jim's latest prediction is 10 feet rise by 2050. We're probably even more than 10 feet rise here because of subsidence and because the 10-foot is worldwide, so ours is going to be more than that. But let's take the most hopeful case, 10 feet by 2050. And most hopeful case, the slope doesn't increase, so it's 20 feet by 2100. So what are your thoughts about New Orleans?
What are my thoughts about New Orleans?
Yeah, I mean, water gardens are fine, and solar panels and the rest of it, but what are your thoughts about New Orleans?
So I just had the opportunity to do a blurb for the back of a book that it was too late to offer a review, although I offered my comments. And my comments were that I was somewhat disturbed to see a chapter calling my hometown doomed. Even though I appreciate, this is the Pilkeys, who are actually also very knowledgeable as geologists. And he called Miami and New Orleans doomed. But I think that some of the facts weren't quite right. And when you see the investment that has been made of the pumping stations and the seawalls and the other walls, and if we get this coastal restoration plan right, I am heartened by that. I'm hopeful, but I'm not sure that's just me as a New Orleanian talking. But, I mean, when you're hearing these numbers, 10 feet, 20 feet, I mean, that's a whole different scale, right? And that is in the lifetime of some of the people in this room. When my son said he wanted to come to Tulane, I said, our family's past is in New Orleans, but I'm not sure our future is there. And that's a heartbreaking thing, because I love that he's here with my family nearby. But what he said was, Mom, it's only 4 years of college. But I don't.
Hansen doesn't predict it in 4 years.
Yeah, no, it's not going to happen in 4 years, and maybe he means 50 anyway. But whatever it is, it's not a good solution. I will say this: I don't know if you saw, but a more recent study came out this week that said that because the precipitation is increasing because of the warming, the atmosphere is taking up some of the water from the oceans, and it's actually dumping it on the land, and it's actually slowing the rate of sea level rise. And see, this is the crazy thing about working on this subject. So for those of you who are students, I mean, you'll never end, up bored in this field, whether you're doing adaptation or mitigation, because who would have thought that the hydrological cycle was going to be affected that way, to where we actually have something that's a counter to the sea level rise because of the rain.
Got a question in the back. Thank you.
Well, I think Since Katrina, you've seen a tremendous diaspora and migration north, especially to some of the outlying parishes, but I'm going to ask you the hard question, because you said some communities have relocated, and it's hard, but it's doable. So my question to you is this: if, for whatever reason, you had to relocate New Orleans, where would you move it?
I'd like to take it to Arlington. Because Arlington, you know, it feels sort of like Wonder Bread where I live. So I mean, y'all come on up. We had a nice time.
We had a very gifted playwright among our students. She went on to produce plays on Broadway and
Oh, Mary
Smithsonian.
Nagel. She's
Mary
one of my
Nagel.
students here. She's
She's
brilliant.
your student and you sent it to us. Exactly right. What a gift. Thank you. She wrote plays. And the second play she wrote was a Katrina play, followed by 50 years later. And it was the same characters, but they all lived in Shreveport. And it was a wonderful answer to your question. Imaginative, ahead of her time.
And there were parts of New Orleans, I saw the play too, where Atlantis, like remember they were undersea.
Hell of a question. Do we spend all of this $50 billion trying to wall off the sea, which is where the big money is going now, or do we invest that money in encouraging people back, giving nature a little space? We have a representative, not a representative, we have attorney for the New Orleans Southeast Flood Protection Authority here, Rock Palermo. Rock, have you done an estimate of what it's going to cost the levee authority to maintain a levee system sufficient to protect against a 10-foot or has the levee authority thought that way?
Well, you obviously have to adopt, you can't do this block by block or parish by parish or even levee system, levee board by levee board. You have to kind of adopt thinking that the smart guys at CPRA know what they're doing, and the combination of diversion projects and engineering, you know, which one do you spend the most money in? And Mark Davis probably has forgotten more than I can talk about on that, but that's the big question is what do you do first? And you can't spend all the money, we don't have enough people to do the jobs that we need to do at one time, and it is a 20-year plan perhaps, or even longer, or continuous plan to constantly be getting ground back through diversion projects and protecting immediately from the storm that may come next year. So you have to balance those two things, and it's a constant balancing process. But to answer your question, as far as the cost, way more than has been estimated. And Mark has written a couple papers on the low math on that.
Next year, when we revisit this issue, we really need to look at the time sequence between when restoration kicks in and when sea level rise occurs.
There's modeling out there now that USGS has done. You can go play around with the toolbar and see what was in earlier, what happens on Wall Street in Plaquemine or somewhere else that may be moving. But yes, you know, the tough part about this is forecasting and trying to adapt engineering to it.
Yes. Other questions? Okay. Well. Oh yes, Miss. Thank you.
Hey, how are you doing? This was a really wonderful talk, so thank you for presenting. I wanted to ask about your thoughts on part of the Paris Accord, specifically loss and damages, and I guess, which is just the idea that those historically responsible for the majority of emissions should bear the brunt of cost for dealing with climate change. But I guess I'm just curious to hear your thoughts, if you think that idea has any traction through the work that you've done of approaching adaptation and mitigation with an equity framework.
It's a great question, and Will Burns, who was here yesterday, is much more of an expert on this and spoke to this point more on the Paris panel. As you can see from my work and my background, it's more state and federal. The loss and damage folks didn't obviously get what they wanted. It's a very difficult conversation. It's a very difficult economic and political climate, as you can imagine, to even meet our $100 billion commitment. which is more to support, mitigation and adaptation. And, there is the concern that loss and damage amounts in some people's minds to reparations and to really, setting up some kind of liability scheme and regime that really it might involve massive transfers. And so I just think, politically it was just too heavy a lift for countries like ours. On a normative basis, I would love to see more support to the people who are on the front lines. I would certainly love to see the conversation that Oliver just started, the very difficult conversation about relocation in our countries, to at least accept people, right? I mean, I saw this with my own family. I mean, it would be heartbreaking. I mean, I can't stand what's happening with Syria, obviously, and these refugees. So, I mean, at least, can we have a constructive conversation about who is going to take in people from small island nations that will be underwater, or places that will have no drinking water or no food supply? We can at least, even if we're not wanting to hand money over, some people will say, well, you hand money over to some of these regimes. Look at what happened in the Marshall Islands, where they had a change in leadership, and you can't trust the guy who's the head of it now. If we gave him all that money, what to do? So maybe we can at least have a conversation about how we're going to accommodate people.
Yeah.
If you could pick one legal tool or framework that needs to change to help address these issues, what would it be? Public trust, intergenerational equity, what would be the best thing?
That's a great question, Brett. What do you think? What do you think? You work at Environmental Law Institute.
Why don't you answer your own question?
Well, I would love your answer, and then I'll think of mine. No, I mean, I have one. The cost-benefit formulas that the Corps has traditionally used, that FEMA has traditionally used, I think all of that has to be reworked. And I will say the convenings that we did to produce that report on 100 recommendations for the President's task force teed that up, and we had a very constructive sort of off-the-record conversation with people in the administration, and people get it, but it's obviously very difficult to do. But, I think we have to take a hard look at all of that, I mean, you saw what happens with cost-benefit when people use it to their own ends down here with what Oliver predicted, right, which happened in Katrina.
I think it's too big for public law. I think it's private law. And I think it's trust, and I think it's damages. That's what did it with the tobacco industry. That's what did it with asbestos. That's what did it with oil. It's too big to fail at the public level, but it's, with luck. The oil and gas industry and others are not too big to fail on the damages side. And of course, that's the major case in this district right now.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, sir.
I have a question. It's obvious that we're on an accelerating cycle to destruction, and efforts have to be redoubled. And I'm thinking that part of that effort must lie in carbon storage. That's part of the problem. So I looked them up, the graduate programs, and to my surprise, the sponsors of the programs were oil companies, Chevron, Shell, Mobil, etc. So my question to you is, if they're going to control the technology to bail us out, so to speak, is that nefarious or helpful?
Wow, that's a great question. So I wasn't aware of that. I mean, I think of like Carnegie Mellon being one of the leaders, and I think they get a lot of federal grants too. But what's interesting about that point is that carbon storage is really used for enhanced oil recovery, as they say. So basically what it's doing right now is it is storing carbon, but it's also pushing out more of the product that we can burn and, have the problems continue. So I think it's self-interest in their part in that regard. I don't think it's necessarily nefarious, but just like, we're doing enhanced oil recovery and getting out more product. Now, as the price of oil has plummeted, I don't think that's probably the best reason to do it anymore. But I will say that, if we don't have a price on carbon, right, if we don't have policies that really cost you something for emitting, whether it's a regulation like the Clean Power Plan or a cap and trade bill, which many of us worked on for years, it's going to be costless just to do that, which is one of the incentives for something like carbon capture and storage.
That's the best answer perhaps to Brad. I mean, the single law that would make the game-changing difference would be carbon tax.
An economy-wide carbon tax.
Yeah. In industry, much of industry favor.
Well, they're already including it in their own internal stuff.
Got it. I think we're ready for refreshments.
For a drink.
But for one thing. I'd like to make footnotes. I was caught in a solar storm, as many of us were in a panel, that ran about 15 minutes late, so I really haven't had a chance to thank you. And I come out of this with 3 thoughts I wanted to share. One is that you should never let Mark Davis imitate your voice. That
was the best Frank.
it's uncanny. It's uncanny. I mean, you could fool my wife. The second is that you should know something about Vicki that she hasn't revealed, and this is something I found out early on when I came here. The crucial issue, the one that just divided the city, was the release of 10 million tons of gypsum waste from Freeport-McMoran facilities upriver right into our drinking water system. And they contained, among other things, radionuclides. And so there was a big hearing. And the school teacher came to the podium, and she took a small girl, and she put her right up in the front of the podium and said to the conveners, the state and the EPA, I don't want my kid to grow in the dark. I've always thought that kid was Vicki. It was a young girl, very attractive. But it wasn't. It was one of her school children, as I understand. One of her students. But Vicki comes from outspoken, committed stock. You could just tell. And the third thing I wanted to say, I just wanted to add my thoughts that I hope are yours. You have no idea how hard it is to put together a circus that has 25, 28 moving parts, and each moving part has its own little traumas and history. Somebody drops, somebody gets stranded on the airplane. I can't find him at the airport, and it goes on. Hotels they booked. It goes on and on. All of those logistics are managed by students who get no credit for it, who get no recognition for it, even from the school, except from us. And there are 2 students then that I'd like to add an honor to as proxies for the rest of you who've worked so hard on this. And it's a gift. And the gift was made by the wife of one of our maintenance people who happens to be an artist and to work with beads. So I said, Kenneth, I need something with beads that imitates the logo of the Environmental Law Society. Do you know what it is? It's a dragonfly. I protested that mightily. I said, no, you want a lion. You want the pelican. You want something out there. No, dragon, an insect. No, they chose an insect. It was a brilliant choice. It's really a beautiful symbol. You find it on the logos. You find it on the masthead. So I said, Kenneth, have your wife make up a tableau of a dragonfly. She understood butterfly. And so we have a wonderful beaded butterfly. And I would like Brandon to come up, who is the head of the Tulane Environmental Law Society. I'm hoping Brandon is here. Good. And I would like Sam to come up, who is the jefe of this particular summit. They work together amazingly, and it happens every year, and they stun you. Let me say this. If you ever run a political campaign, here are the people who need to direct. If you ever want to invade a small country, they will put it together. There's nothing they cannot do. And for that reason, I'd like to give you this wonderful butterfly with the hopes that you'll hang it in your office, and you will. That will be a permanent memory of you guys. Thanks very much. And thank you all. We'll see you at the reception.